This is the simulation we came up with in previous lessons. The first thing I want to do is to remove this building in order to have more room for the asteroid. Now, let's take a closer look at the flow emitter's properties. Remember, in order to update the same property for all the objects, you have to select all the pieces of the collection and press the Alt button before pressing the Enter key. Or you can right-click on the property and select Copy to Selected. So, let's increase the sampling sub-step parameter. As we have seen, this is more useful when we have a fast-moving object. So, in this case, a slight increase can be enough, for example 4. However, we can leave this parameter as it is for now. Indeed, this can slow down the simulation playback. If you take a look at the asteroid, the smoke and fire are emitted far away from the asteroid surface. We can reduce this gap by decreasing the surface emission property inside the Flow Source tab, for example 0.5. The fire is now closer to the surface. Another useful parameter is the initial velocity. We want the fire and smoke to have an additional velocity from the movement of the asteroid fragments. So, let's check the initial velocity property. If you set a positive value in the source field, the smoke has an additional velocity in the same direction of the movement of the asteroid. But in this case, I want the smoke to move in the opposite direction in order to have a more energetic smoke trail. A value from -0.5 to -1 is okay. I will set to -0.5. You can also play with the other properties, such as initial temperature or fuel, in order to change the smoke and flames appearance. I will leave the default values for now. We can move on to the domain properties. The first parameter we should change is the resolution divisions. For the final render, it should be at least 128 or higher. We can leave as it is for now, in order to speed up the simulation. We can also increase the time steps maximum and minimum, for example 10 and 6. This is useful to increase the accuracy of the simulation. But if you start the simulation, the smoke and fire seem to flow in a completely different way than before. This is an important aspect to point out, and is strictly related to what I explained about the time steps meaning. When we increase this value, Blender is forced to increase simulation steps for each frame. As a result, the motion and flow of the fluid can be different than before, due to the increased accuracy of the simulation. In our case, we can set 6 and 4 as values for these properties. Now we can go back to the properties of the emitters, and try to change some values in order to have a nice smoke flow. For example, I want the smoke trail to be narrower and move faster upward. So we can reduce the surface emission value to 0.2, and the source initial velocity to -0.8. Now it's also time to slightly increase the resolution divisions value, in order to have a more accurate view of the final result. Let's set this value to 64. It is also a good idea to turn on the adaptive domain property. As you can see, now the domain is resized in each frame, and this allows the simulation to be much faster. We can leave the properties in the gas tab as they are, but feel free to experiment with different values. Now it's time to set the proper cache method and folder. So, in the Cache tab, switch to Modular and check the As Resumable property. Then, choose a cache folder. Now you can press the Bake Data button in order to save the simulation to disk. As we have checked the As Resumable property, we can stop the simulation baking at any time by pressing the Escape key. In this way, we can take a look at the simulation without having to wait for the end. Then, you can press the Resume button in order to complete the baking of the simulation. Otherwise, press the Free button to delete the actual bake. As a last step, we have to activate the Noise property. As we already saw, this is useful to increase the fine details. You can leave the uppers factor to the default value of 2. I also suggest to reduce the strength factor to something like 0.1, as we don't want to add much noise to the smoke and fire flow. Now, you have to separately bake the data and then the noise. Of course, if some of the fragments come out of the domain, you can resize it. We can still improve the simulation in 2 ways. First of all, it would be better for the smoke to gradually disappear. We can do that by activating the Dissolve property. Before doing that, you have to free the baking data. Now click on the Dissolve checkbox and set a proper value for the time parameter. Consider that the higher this value is, the slower the smoke disappears. A value of 50 can be a good choice. We can bake the simulation again and see the final result. At first glance it seems all fine, but sometimes there might be a strange issue in the domain movement. Basically, at some point, the domain suddenly shrinks, for example here, and, consequently, the smoke is cut out. We didn't have the same issue when played the simulation in the replay mode. In this case, we didn't activate the Dissolve property. So, this may be an issue related to this. In some cases, this can also be due to the way the size of the domain is computed. When the density of the smoke, in a particular space, is below a defined threshold, the domain is scaled down, in order to save computation resources. We can reduce this issue in 2 ways. First of all, we can add more margin around the domain, for example 10. And we can also reduce the threshold value, at which Blender consider the space inside a cell as empty. For example, let's set a value of 0.01. Let's bake the simulation again. If the issue is not solved, as in this case, you can simply disable the adaptive domain option. It will take a longer time to bake, but it should also definitively solve the issue. The last improvement we can do is to add some energy and power to the simulation when the asteroid hits the ground. In order to do that, we can take advantage of the properties inside the Fire tab. These parameters are related to the intensity and height of the flames. For example, increasing the reaction speed property will result in smaller flames. You can also tweak the temperature maximum and minimum in order to have higher flames. So, the idea is to animate these properties when the asteroid hits the ground. We can add a keyframe for all these properties to frame 92. To add a keyframe, move the mouse over a field and press the I key. Now move a few frames forward and change the related values. For example, 0.4 for the reaction speed, 1.5 for the flame smoke, 0.7 for the vorticity, and, finally, 5 for the temperature maximum property. Very good. We completed all the main steps to have a nice asteroid simulation. As a final step, we have to create the material for the smoke and fire. Now it's time to create the material for the fire and smoke. Consider that, in order to have more details, I baked again the smoke with a resolution divisions of 128. Select the domain and in the material panel, create a new material. Then open the shading workspace. For this topic, I assume that you already have a basic knowledge on how to create materials and nodes. First of all, delete the principled shader and add the principled volume shader. Indeed, we are dealing with a volume, so we don't need the surface shader. Now select a proper view and move to a frame where the smoke and fire are clearly visible. Finally, select Rendered as Viewport method. Check that you have selected Cycles as rendering engine. You can also temporarily hide the buildings, the sky images, and the collision plane. The principled volume shader contains all the parameters we need to create a realistic fire and smoke material. The color parameter is related to the global color of the smoke. But, if you have animate the color, as discussed some lessons ago, you have to write color in the color attribute field. This is an important question to point out. In a fluid simulation, Blender automatically creates many attributes that stores different types of data. We can see some of these attributes in the Viewport Display tab of the domain object. Let's go back to the solid viewport mode for a moment. Then activate the Grid Display option. In the Field tab you can see all the attributes related to the simulation. The default attribute is the density, and it is basically the density distribution of the smoke. If you select Flame, you can see the distribution of the flames in the fire component. We don't see the color attribute, as it is related to the fluid emitter. However, what is important to know is that we have some attributes that can be used to our advantage in the fire shader. Let's uncheck the Grid Display option and activate again the Rendered Viewport method. The density field is useful to globally multiply the density of the smoke. However, do not increase too much this parameter. If you want to increase the density a lot, you should physically add more smoke to the simulation, for example increasing the density in the flow emitter, the flame smoke and the fire tab of the domain, or increasing the volume of the emitter itself. The density attribute in the volume shader is related to the appearance of the material and can produce some artifacts if increased too much. Below, we have the density attribute. This is the attribute that Blender uses to compute the distribution of the smoke. If you delete this field, there is no more data on how to distribute the density of the smoke. And, as you can see, each voxel is completely filled with smoke. The interesting thing about attributes is that you are free to use them as you want. For example, you can use the heat or temperature attributes instead of the original density. This, although not physically correct, gives you more freedom from an artistic point of view. Another way to stylize the shape of the smoke is to use the density attribute as an input value for the density itself. Currently, the density attribute is uniformly multiplied by the value in the density field. So, if we set 2 as density value, the actual density value is uniformly multiplied by 2 in each position in the space. But we can take a step forward. First of all, add a new attribute node. In the field name, type density. In this way, we are using the density attribute. Then, plug the factor value in the density field of the volume shader. As you can see, the shape of the smoke slightly changes. Basically, now we are multiplying the density by the density itself. We can also add a math node and set it to the power operation. By increasing this value, we are increasing the contrast in the smoke. You can also add more mathematical operations to find the best shape for you. And you can also change the input parameter, for example heat. Anyway, the concept to keep in mind is that you can use any of the volume attributes as input values for the actual properties. This is also true for any of the following attributes of the volume shader. For now, let's unplug this attribute from the density input. The next parameter is the anisotropy one. This refers to a different physical property of a material in relation to the different directions. This can be useful to add some variety to the material, and, in the case of the smoke, mostly in the way it reacts to the backlight. So we can set any value above 0, for example 0.3. The emission strength attribute is very interesting. It refers to the ability of the volume to emit some light. If you set 1 as value, the smoke becomes a fully emissive volume. However, it seems that each voxel is a full light. But we don't want to do that. As in the case of the smoke, we want to correctly shape this light. And, again, the right way to do that is to plug one of the volume attributes as input values. For example, let's try with the density attribute. This means that the density of the smoke defines the emission power of each point of the volume. But the emission shape is now exactly as the original smoke. If you change the attribute to heat, a smaller portion of the smoke becomes emissive. And if you change the value to flame, an even smaller part is included. This is useful to control the portion of the smoke you want to become an emission volume. This will be clearer when we see how to add fire. We can also change the color of the light. Let's unplug the emission strength for now. The next parameter, the blackbody intensity, is the one that controls the fire material and color. If you set the value to 1 or any value you want, you can finally see some beautiful fire. The color and intensity of the fire is controlled by the temperature attribute. As in the real life, the higher the temperature, the more yellow and white the flames become. On the other hand, the lower the temperature, the more red the flames become. So, now we have some smoke and fire. But there is another improvement we can do. The fire seems to end up very close to the asteroid. How can we extend the flames? We can take advantage of what we already saw, the emission property. Let's plug the heat attribute in the emission strength property. The heat attribute is useful in this case because it gives the right distribution of density. If you try with the flame or temperature attributes, the emission ends soon. However, the emission has not the right color. In order to have the same color as the original fire, we have to add a blackbody node and plug it into the emission color property. As a last step, we have to shape the emission value, otherwise it completely overlooks the smoke below. So, let's add again a power math node and increase its value until you get the desired shape. Now we can show again the other buildings and the sky planes and have a look at the final scene. I hope this course has provided you with the basic concepts of fire and flame simulation.